The first thing to say on the question of his management is he was allowed a huge amount of leeway. All the money, it seems, was concentrated in his hands. There was no audits done. Typically, if you control a center and you're based on donations, you have to fill out a mountain of papers every year accounting for where the money went, what did you accomplish, what did you achieve, what are your plans. It's not easy. You're usually under very close scrutiny. In his case, it seems that there was no audit done on the monies. There was no oversight. There wasn't even a board of overseers. Everything was concentrated in his hands. And one has to add to that, he had no record as an administrator. He was literally scooped up off the street and put in this very prominent, high-profile position with no known expertise, no track record in administration.
Oh my God.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another ArtiFact. I am joined by Professor Norman Finkelstein. He's the author of books such as Beyond Chutzpah on the Israel-Palestine conflict. Most recently, he's the author of I'll Burn That Bridge When I Get to It. It's a book that focuses on things like wokeness and political correctness, academic freedom, questions of legality, such as he covers the Roe v. Wade decision of last year quite prominently in the text. And today we're going to discuss one of the chapters in his book on the work of Ibram X Kendi. And I think this is very topical now because Kendi is in the news. He's recently on the cusp, if not of a cancellation, perhaps a pretty significant blow to his reputation. I think if you followed Kendi's work, you should have seen at least some of this coming. So back in 2020, he received about $10 million from the ex-CEO of Twitter, Jack Dorsey. It seems in total, the center was working with something like 30 to up to over $40 million. When he founded his anti-racist center at BU, there's accusations that there was bullying. Lots of workers were leveling all kinds of complaints starting as early as 2020 and 2021. They were complaining that research was not actually getting done. Nothing was actually happening. They were wondering, well, where's all this money going? Because it seems like nothing is truly coming out. Different people, I guess, associated with BU, they basically leveled the accusation that this anti-racist center was more or less a way for BU to whitewash its own racial problems. And if you read Norman Finkelstein's book, you will see that this is where he's kind of going with some of his critique. For instance, BU has, I believe, a Black acceptance rate. They have about something like 4.8% of the students are Black, over 3,000 faculty members, and yet something like 71 are Black women. Only 7 of them are tenure track professors. So, I mean, it's a huge mess. Kendi, for his part, his response is more or less along the lines of, well, Black leaders in the past have always had their decision-making skills second-guessed, and this is what's going on here. So I wonder if we could just start, Norman, with your responses to the recent accusations.
Well, I would want to begin by making what to my mind is a critical distinction, and that is Ibram X Kendi as an administrator or executive director of this so-called Anti-Racism Center, and Ibram X Kendi as a scholar, as an academic. It happens that that distinction works neatly because Kendi holds 2 positions. He's the Andrew Mellon Professor of the Humanities in Boston University, so he holds an academic position. and he's the director of the so-called Anti-Racism Center. So he's also a head administrator. Right now, all of the attention has been focused on the second of his so-called, if you want to call it, second of his identities, namely as the executive director. And the claim has been made that he's, at the very least, he's culpable for gross mismanagement of the monies that were donated to the center. The estimates I've read, most recent estimates, run between 40-something and 50-something million dollars. They still maintain an endowment, that center, of about 17 million, which would mean roughly, maybe approximately 25 to 30 million are MIA, missing in action, or in this case, missing in inaction, because there doesn't seem to have been any substantive result from this investment. So, having made that distinction, the first thing to say on the question of his management is he was allowed a huge amount of leeway. All the money, it seems, was concentrated in his hands. There was no audits done. Typically, if you control a center and you're based on donations, you have to fill out a mountain of papers every year accounting for where the money went, what did you accomplish, what did you achieve, what are your plans. It's not easy to administrate in a center or foundation. You're usually under very close scrutiny. In his case, it seems that there was no audit done on the monies. There was no oversight. There wasn't even a board of overseers. Everything was concentrated in his hands. And one has to add to that, he had no record as an administrator. He was literally scooped up off the street and put in this very prominent, high-profile position with no known expertise, no track record in administration. And I know from personal correspondence with people at the center over the past several years that there was a scandal brewing from pretty much the get-go. People were writing me because they knew I had criticized not his management skills, but his scholarship. And I did say along the way that he was a charlatan and a hustler. And so people were writing me. Actually, one of the persons who stepped forward in the most recent controversy was a correspondent of mine. And this person sent very long emails with very detailed descriptions of what was not happening, describing what was not happening at the center, because nothing was happening, except for the fact that Mr. Kendi was using the center as a vehicle to promote his books. So the only substantive undertaking, so far as anyone can tell, was his National Anti-Racism Book Fair, which occurred every year. And you can imagine the book fair was just an instrument or vehicle to showcase his so-called books. On that subject, I'm going to just speak for a half moment, and then we'll move on to what, in my mind, is the more important question, namely Kendi as a scholar. And this will be a segue to Kendi as a scholar. So if you look at Kendi's current resume, he describes himself as having written 15 books. Now, that's quite an achievement, bearing in mind that his first or his second published book was 2 years ago, namely, well, what year did Stamped from the Beginning come out?
That must have been, I think it was before 2019, and 2019 was How to Be an Anti-Racist.
Okay,
So
so
it's probably longer than that, yeah.
Right. So we're talking about 15 books in a very short period of time. Now, I remember an incident where one summer I went to spend a few days with Professor Chomsky in his summer home. And when I came home, a close friend of mine said, "So, what is Professor Chomsky up to?" And I said, "He finished 2 books." So my friend replied, "Big deal. I read 2 books this summer also." Well, I thought to myself, that's what distinguishes Professor Chomsky from other mortal men. He wrote 2 books in the summer. Most of us are pleased if we've read 2 books in the summer. But now comes along Ibram X Kendi, and he's written roughly a little more than the summer, we can put it that way. He's said to have written 15 books. Yes, it's true. There are 15 books with his name affixed on them. So what are these books? One book is How to Be an Anti-Racist. Another is How to Be an Anti-Racist Baby. And then you go down, How to Be an Anti-Racist Toilet Seat. And How to Be an Anti-Racist Toothpick. And How to Be an Anti-Racist Lamp. And How to Be an Anti-Racist Keyboard. He took one book. He's still in the midst of spin-offs. I think there's another spin-off coming out. And this is called Writing 15 Books. And that brings us to the second half of his, as it were, identity, since we're in the world of identity politics. That's the identity as a scholar. Now, to my thinking, but this may be because of my own vocation in life, what's more scandalous is not what he did as a mismanager, apparently a mismanager, but the claims he makes to being a scholar, and what's 10,000 times worse, the fact that these claims never came under any public criticism or scrutiny except from the right wing. The right wing, there have been several critiques of him. I wouldn't call them substantial because I don't think anyone really read the book. That's not an unusual phenomenon in the world of American arts and letters, where books reach the top of the bestseller list, but they're coffee table items. In this case, it's a coffee table item to show off how woke you are. So you prominently display it, as woke bookstores now are wont to do. You could say maybe he made it as a scholar, or at least he got some credibility. You could say maybe because his book was published by a high-profile publisher. That's possible. A Random House book, a Penguin book, a Harvard University book. Yes, that's it's an automatic. It gives you a kind of credibility. Whether it's deserved or not, I'll leave aside, but it does. But his book came out from Nation Books. Nation Books is just a tiny little outfit, rink-a-dink outfit. No offense, because I mostly publish by those kinds of publishers, but that's not going to get me any kind of public acclaim unless there's something really stellar in the book. So then you could say, well, maybe it's his academic pedigree. You know, if you got a Harvard degree, you got a Columbia degree, that's going to open doors. It does. Maybe it's not fair, maybe it's not right, but it does. But his degree, he got his college degree from Florida A&M, in a historically Black college, HBCU. And then he got his PhD from Temple University. And he studied under what's called an Afrocentric, this guy named Asante, who's frankly raving mad. So those kinds of degrees, they don't open doors. So then you ask yourself, what's going on here? He doesn't have this stellar academic pedigree. He doesn't have an outstanding publisher. He has no administrative training. How did he land these two plum positions? He is the Andrew Mellon Professor of the Humanities. Do you know what, speaking as an academic, that is top tier. You know, most people start out as adjuncts. They get paid per semester. And he was catapulted to Andrew Mellon Professor of the Humanities. He probably gets paid for that position somewhere in the order of $300,000 a year. Then he gets the directorship of the Anti-Racism Center, for which I know because it's public knowledge. He gets paid $480,000 a year for somebody with no record. Now, it's true, he won the National Book Award, and he was the youngest recipient ever of the National Book Award. And then that brings us to the question, how did that come to pass? What is in this amazing book, stamped from the beginning? What is in it that should have resulted in such fantastical? Listen, I'm an academic. Believe me, even if I managed to get tenure, which I did not, it is a very painful, anguishing process. You know, any professor, even the best professor, during that tenure process is so closely scrutinized. No, I'm serious. You have to go jump through so many hoops to get tenure. It's a very degrading and demeaning process because you basically, beyond having to be very productive, you really do. You have to publish at least 2 books and so forth with good publishers. It's a very grueling process. Jumping through those hoops, I didn't manage. No tenure process, nothing. He's catapulted to the highest position, the Andrew Mellon Professor of the Humanities. How did that happen? It had to have been something utterly brilliant in this book. That's the only explanation. So, as an undertaking, I noticed there were some right-wing criticisms of his book, but they were pretty superficial, I would say. Nobody had actually undertaken to parse the scholarship. What's there? And that's what I did. Now, I will admit what I produced was very long and tedious. It's 110 pages. Yes, it's very tedious. I am the first one to acknowledge it. But I felt the reason it's tedious is because I felt nobody else had done it. This book made a spectacular career. It's like Darwin's on the origin of the species. So what's in it? And it was quite a revelation to discover that there was nothing in it. It was just name calling. It was attaching the label racist or anti-racist to every exemplary figure in African American history, with virtually all of them, be it the colonial America figure Phyllis Wheatley, the poet, be it Frederick Douglass, be it Richard Wright, or to add insult to injury, if I might use that expression, all the abolitionists those heroic figures like Wendell Phillips, Charles Sumner, William Lloyd Garrison, all of those African-American, white, tiny number of white people, but truly heroic figures, they're all labeled racist. They're all labeled racist. Who are the anti-racists? Okay? The anti-racists can fit on the fingers of one hand. Zora Neale Hurston, anti-racist. Eldridge Cleaver, anti-racist. Malcolm X, anti-racist. Angela Davis, anti-racist. Kanye West, anti-racist. That's it. Everybody else is a racist.
Let me just ask you, let me ask you about that as a kind of meta question. Do you think there's any kind of value in a book that goes back through history and tries to extract every more or less example that one can find going back like thousands of years of racist thought? Because to me, I've always just been under the assumption, for instance, that if you go back to, pretty much any thinker, other than modern day people, you're going to find racist material simply because that's just how everybody thought. I
don't think that's exactly true, because there are many examples of people who actually didn't think that way. So you take the case of the time of the discovery. There were always critics of slavery around who knew it was wrong. As a matter of fact, the British like to heap ridicule and mockery on the American revolutionaries, talking about freedom and then cracking the whip on their slaves.
But I mean, but generally speaking, like
I forgot to disconnect my phone. Excuse me for one half. Got to disconnect the phone. Okay, go ahead.
But generally speaking, yes, of course, exceptions exist. Even in the time of Rome, for instance, right? You have people like Seneca criticizing not so much slavery, which was a bridge too far for him, but the kind of
by the way, the name is De las Casas. De las Casas. Yeah, go ahead.
So, I mean, like Seneca, for instance, he criticized not so much slavery, but the specific kind of slavery that was practiced. You will find examples of people saying what Kendi might. Let me just finish, like saying like anti-racist things. But at the same time, if you put all the famous people right in history and you put their names in a hat, most likely, if you pull some name out, you will find, if not a controlling factor for their lives, at least a stray comment or something that would indicate, this person probably had racist thoughts.
Look, we're all, as Cornel West likes to say, Dr. West likes to say, we're all come on out of our mother's wombs, cracked vessels. So there are always going to be imperfections. Now, there are two things I would say in this matter. Number one, I do think it's useful if we demonstrate that people who are depicted as perfect vessels are then shown to be imperfect vessels. You might call it muckraking, but muckraking does serve a purpose, I think. It was very useful for me growing up when I started to read Professor Chomsky's works, and he started to quote remarks by all sorts of exalted historical figures, which show them to be very imperfect. Now, so that's a useful, in my opinion, that's a useful exercise. What's not particularly useful is if that's the be-all and end-all. We have to carry on
exactly
an assessment and evaluation of a human being. Martin Luther King, as a person, and he was the first one to acknowledge it to himself, Martin Luther King was an imperfect human being, as was Gandhi. Does that negate their historical achievements? And number two, does it really add very much once you acknowledge a person has an imperfection here, or imperfections, plural? Once you acknowledge that, then does it add anything to affix these labels on them and just call them racist. Does that add anything? I don't think so. I don't think it adds anything. You'll never hear me call somebody a fascist because I don't find that the label is particularly illuminating. As a matter of fact, recently I wrote a long article saying I don't see the purpose of describing the threat that Donald Trump presents. You could say he presents an authoritarian threat. I think so. He presents a threat of political repression. But I said, if you look historically at what the term fascist meant, it doesn't really have much relevance to the Donald Trump phenomenon. And I would say the same thing with racist. Long before Ibram X Kendi came
Henry
along,
Rogers.
Right. Whatever. Long before he came along, we all knew that there were significant imperfections in Abraham Lincoln. Okay? Abraham Lincoln didn't believe that Black and white people can coexist together in the same territory. Abraham Lincoln believed in colonization. There are many things you could say about Abraham Lincoln. On the other hand, is that the beginning, the middle, and the end of Abraham Lincoln? I think the best historical assessment of Abraham Lincoln came from the pen of Frederick Douglass. At one point, African Americans, under Douglass's initiative, decided that they were on their own going to dedicate a monument to him. And on the occasion of the setting of the monument, or erected, however, on that occasion, he wrote this absolutely brilliant assessment of Lincoln, in which he starts out by saying, it's true, Lincoln was a white man's president. We shouldn't fool ourselves about that. His first concern was white people. And he starts off with all the limits on Lincoln's greatness, and then he proceeds to describe a great man. He proceeds to describe in the annals of history a great, great man. And that's what a historian does. And then the historian at the end, he or she, then weighs the good and the bad, how the good interacts with the bad, how the bad interacts with the good. That's called an old-fashioned Marxist talk that was called a dialectical analysis, and then reaches a historical judgment. I remember when I read Joachim Fest, the German historian, he wrote the first great biography of Hitler. And at the end of it, he had to come to an assessment which was very strange to my ear, very strange. Was Hitler a great man? Was Hitler a great man? That's with any towering historical figure, that's the job of a historian. Did Joachim Fest limit himself to saying, well, Hitler was a Nazi? Well, we already knew that. Hitler was a fascist. Well, we already knew that. The real struggle is trying to make an assessment of a person and his or her good and bad within the context of the times, but always being careful about this notion of context of the times. Because you take the case of Teddy Roosevelt. He wrote the most absolutely hideous things about Native Americans. I mean, it literally could have been Mein Kampf. It really could have. It's just ghastly. And he had a contemporary. Her name was Helen Hunt Jackson. Helen Hunt Jackson was a notable writer. And she wrote a book called A Century of Dishonor, describing what was done to the Native Americans. A very powerful book. And Roosevelt was not happy with that book. And he devotes quite a lot of space to denouncing her and denouncing the book. My point being, there were contemporaries who knew what was being done to the Native Americans was horrible. Roosevelt was aware of those contemporaries. So we have to always be careful about using this extenuation, this moral extenuation of, well, you have to understand the times. And that's true of the left. You see, let's be clear about that. That's true of the left. I've known many wonderful human beings who were outright apologists for Stalin. My first mentor, my dear friend, he wasn't really a friend, my dear mentor, Paul Sweezy, the great Marxist economist, the greatest of his generation.
The monthly review economist?
Yes. Harvard educated, brilliant guy. But he was a complete apologist for Stalin. And I once asked him, well, Paul, how do you feel in light of in light of what's been revealed? And he said to me, Norman, you have to understand the times. You have to understand the times. And in part, there's truth to that, the feeling that there was only two choices between the Nazis and those who were playing the overwhelming role in defeating the Nazis, namely the Red Army. So in part, there's an argument, but also when Joseph Stalin died, Paul Sweezy wrote in Monthly Review, his magazine that he edited. He wrote, quote, "There is no doubt that Joseph Stalin will go down in history as one of the great revolutionaries." And when I read that in the 1970s, my heart sank. I was so disappointed, which is to say, when he wrote that, and when Stalin died, I guess Stalin died in 1953, it was already very well known what he had done. The war was over, so the argument about you have to understand the times. So one has to be, I think, cautious about using this argument about the times. And I would say Kendi's book doesn't do any of that. I read the book very carefully. All I saw was the promiscuous flinging of labels on people, no analysis, no attempt to do what a historian does.
To comment on some of the things you just said. So first of all, on the question of greatness, I think it's very useful for people to, because like I think in most people's minds, the word good and great could be somehow synonymous, but I think it's probably more useful to view greatness as a totally amoral quality, right? You could have a kind of greatness in something that's just like totally evil, right? And unjustifiable in the kinds of ways that we think about the world. You could have greatness that artistic greatness that breaks in a totally different direction. Specifically in the case of Stalin, I'm always amused by Westerners that have these like very positive views of figures like Stalin. But at the same time, I'm also very aware, right, being from Belarus and my family being from Russia, right, my great grandmother, she absolutely loved Stalin to the day that she died. She was
so did my mother and father.
And specifically with your parents being Holocaust survivors, right? That would be a part of it. My great grandmother, she remembers essentially hiding out, having absolutely nothing to eat. She would tell me things like, "I can't believe that I never thought there would be a day when I could see a piece of bread on the table and not want to eat it and eat the whole thing right away." That's how hungry she was during World War II. So in her mind, being, somebody that's essentially a peasant, she had, the pre-war and the post-war experience. The central figure there is going to be Stalin. Guess what? That's going to bring Stalin a whole lot of political legitimacy. A lot of Westerners right now, they're freaking out about figures like Putin. And we could say so many negative things about him, but the fact is, he probably has, in the eyes of Russian people, more political legitimacy than any president that we had in like the last 50 years, because for Russians that, were alive in the 80s and the 90s, they have the experience of the 90s, and then they have the stabilization after the 90s. When Putin ran in his 99 campaign, he said it's going to be, the phrase was, a dictatorship of the law. That's a very strong contrast from the experience of the 90s. Xi Jinping, if you were around in China in the 80s, right, and this, let's say you were born when I was born, 1987. Now, in 1987 to 2023 in America, it's not a huge amount of differences. There's some, but it's not huge. In China, 87 versus 23, we're talking about a middle class that was maybe 10% or 5% back then, to now it's like 60 or 70% of the people. That is not anything that we could really conceptualize. So that's kind of how these things work. Specifically, like people like Lincoln, I agree with your assessment. And I think it is kind of psychologically useful to, on the one hand, acknowledge that, yes, Lincoln, for instance, he was clearly a racist. But on the other hand, isn't there something, to go back to the idea of greatness, isn't there something great about a human being who could simultaneously be racist, but also say, you know what? What if in some way I think that I might be wrong? What if my racist feelings should be superseded by the idea that we need to get rid of slavery? That's a separate question, right? Yeah.
That's what Dr. West said when we did the interview. You just have to be very impressed by the personal transformation, which seems to have been authentic. I mean, there is a line. I don't have it. Let me see if I could. What's that guy's? Oh, yeah. I'm going to just read one line, if you'll forgive me. One sentence. It's not mine. I'm not promoting my book. I'm promoting Abraham Lincoln, which is something. It's a different order. So on page 303, fortunately, I have a name index, which I created. Abraham Lincoln gives the second inaugural, okay? The speech for the second inaugural, very short. Even the Gettysburg Address is very short. You'd be very surprised. I thought it was a very long document until I started to read Lincoln. So this is what Lincoln says in the second inaugural. Yet, if God wills that the Civil War continue until all the wealth piled by the bondsmen, the slaves, 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, that is to say, now my paraphrase of his brilliant prose, if the Civil War continues to the point that all the unearned wealth that we acquired through slavery will be squandered because of the war, will be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash, every drop of blood that was drawn with the slave driver's lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword. That means for all the blood of African Americans that was spilt by the slave driver, if all that blood was then paid back with all the deaths in the Civil War, and it was 700,000 deaths, he says, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. I would say I'm heading towards 70 years old. That is the single most stirring line I have ever read in my life. Yes. And coming from Abraham Lincoln, if all the money we extracted unfairly from those slaves for 250 years, and all the blood that was spilt by the slaves due to the slave driver's lash. If all of that is lost, because now it's Americans, whites, who are dying in the Civil War, 700,000, not a small number. He said, it's still worth it because it's right to end the slavery. It's the moral sentiment combined with the prose. There is an awful lot in that one sentence, And then to reduce the magnitude of what's going on in that one sentence to just hurling a label, racist. Is that history? It's just stupid. It's just stupid.
The last line is reminiscent of Herman Melville's Moby Dick, the final line there. The great shroud of the sea rolled on as it did 5,000 years ago. Just to dwell just a tiny bit more on Stamped.
That may have been an impact because Melville was
he might not actually have, because Melville went through a period where his last 20 years of life, everything that he wrote was out of print, including Moby Dick. Nobody really knew him that well until the 1920s.
It was known, I think it was known that he was a public defender of John Brown.
Mm-hmm. So
that aspect of Melville, I don't know. Look, I'm completely speculating, but that aspect may have been known. In any case, there are spectacular moments. Listen, you can say 10,000 things about Martin Luther King, but I think that last speech he gave on April 3rd, 1968, that speech on the eve of his assassination, I think that's the greatest speech ever given in human history. I do. I've talked to many people about that. There's nothing really that compares to it. That last speech, I still tear up, and I must have listened to it 100 times. But he was a very flawed vessel, and he was the first. Martin Luther King was consumed. He was eaten away by guilt because he had a very promiscuous private life. It was known because his phones were tapped by the FBI. The FBI blackmailed him, or attempted to blackmail him, with that information. And he was consumed by guilt because he felt he didn't deserve all the praise that was being heaped on him. And he felt he was a very flawed human being. And he was. We're all flawed, as Dr. West says, cracked vessels. But can you deny his greatness in the face of that? No. Does hurling the label racist, or in this case, the label of adulterer, does that capture his whole life? No.
This comment on MLK reminds me of, so when I was reading Stamped, the first thing I thought was, okay, so if this book is just going to be this catalog of racial slights, both personal and public, going back thousands of years, wouldn't it have achieved the same exact ends if Kendi were to, this is the way that I would do it, a poetic introduction, a poetic conclusion, and 5-6 pages in between where, in a very emotionless fashion, you just go through just direct quotes from all these random figures that you think are totally disconnected, save for the fact that they have, racial supremacist beliefs about this or that. That would have it would have hit upon all the notes that he wanted, and you wouldn't have to.
Well, that's all known. That's all known. I mean, it's not like
I understand, but that could be used as a stepping stone to discuss something else altogether. And an example that I would use is, so speaking of MLK and his promiscuity, I remember when I was 12 years old, 13 years old, and I had just got on the internet for the first time. I was arguing a lot with white nationalists and Nazis in the various forums like stormfront.org or whatever. So as a kid, I was actually like already arguing with like random people online. And one thing that would have been very useful to me is something that Kendi refuses to do in the book. So when it comes to dealing with, let's say, the science of race and racism, the science of white supremacy and whatnot, he alludes to it, but he engages with it not at all, not even a little bit. When I was growing up, I was thinking it would be so much easier for me to argue with these Nazis if I had like an easy way to find some of these arguments online or elsewhere, all put together in a way, constructed in a way where they would be unanswerable. So the thing where he could have actually been useful in some fashion, he refuses to do because probably because it's honestly harder to do that. You would have to like, I don't know, read something about the science, which could often be kind of boring. And also it's like, I mean, to what end? You're just reading science to prove that white and black people are equal. Like, it's just very silly, right? Listen, and he refuses to do that. And it's the one useful thing that he could have done.
First of all, he couldn't have done it because he has no knowledge of the sciences whatsoever.
Yeah.
Neither do I. I mean, I stopped science after high school, and I took several semesters of calculus in college, but that was it. There are several things to be said in that. Number one, you're absolutely correct. He just takes it as a wokeism. We're all equal. Let's move on. Number two, it's been done. There are a large number of people who participate in what's called racial science, and there's a large number of people who push back on racial science. It has a very long history of those two contending forces of the racial science and the anti-racial science. So it's all been done. Number three, as you say, it's a very technical field. Very few people have the capacity to write about it, to understand it, let alone write about it. And number four, in my opinion, it's utterly and totally meaningless as an endeavor. I'm glad there are people who are on the anti-racist front or anti-racialist front, but it's absolutely meaningless because there are no definitive conclusions that can be extracted from this kind of research. The case on one side cannot be shown to be completely bankrupt. The case on the other side cannot be shown to be completely correct. And the fact of the matter is, most people are simply going to go with their prejudice. They're going to read what they like, and they're going to cite what they like. But beyond that, they're not going to be able to make a case. They're just going with their prejudice. My own view is that the only way you can refute these beliefs in practice is it's the proof of the pudding is in the eating. When I grew up, which is obviously a long time ago, I remember in high school, I had two friends, Stephen Schlossberg and Scott Addison, Stephen Schlossberg and Peter Addison. Peter Addison became a successful urologist. Stephen Schlossberg became also, I think, a urologist, but then he was the director at Yale Medical Center, and he's still very prominent. And they were Ivy League aspirants. So if you were a Jew in high school and you're an Ivy League aspirant, part of being an Ivy League aspirant is you want to be Ivy League in your profile. So what did they do? They played tennis, which was Ivy League, and they played golf. That's what WASPs did. You played tennis and you played golf. So this is the 1970s, and we once were in a conversation, and they said to me, you know why there are no Black people or African Americans? I don't remember the term back then. You know why there are no Black people or African Americans in golf or tennis? I said, no. Why? They said, because those sports require intelligence. That's what they told me. Those sports require intelligence. So they were quite committed to the idea that it was intelligence that accounted for, so to speak, the deficit of Black persons in those sports. That was before Arthur Ashe. That was before Tiger Woods. The point being, in my opinion, the only way you can refute those sorts of prejudices is by people demonstrating in practice. It starts with an individual, but then you have to reach, so then people say exception to the rule. We know the game. You say, oh, yes, it's true. Arthur Ashe is a great tennis player. Serena Williams is a great tennis player. Tiger Woods is a great golf player. But that's the exception to the rule.
Aren't these people just so low? Ironically, they're so low IQ, making these kinds of arguments. Like when I think of some of the stuff, it's like you are a mental deficient, and you're adjudicating other people's intelligence.
In my generation, one of the most significant proponents of the intellectual inferiority of Black people was Shockley from Stanford, and Shockley was a Nobel laureate. He was a Nobel laureate. Don't think the two can't go hand in hand. You could be a Nobel laureate, and you could be I don't want to say. See, but
the actual mental deficiency. They point to Watson or Shockley and say, look, if they could do it, I could. Maybe I could get some of their light, some of that halo effect.
Well, my point being that you start off with individuals, and then at some point you reach a critical mass where so many people are no longer conforming to the stereotype that it's simply untenable to repeat that stereotype. So nowadays, can anyone with a straight face really say that the reason Black people aren't in tennis or golf is because those sports require intelligence? Listen, when they said that to me in the early 70s, I really didn't know how to answer. Of course, you can make the obvious answer. Well, the reason why is because there are not that many golf clubs, or golf courses in Black neighborhoods, and there weren't at that time many tennis courts in Black neighborhoods. Those were very privileged sanctuaries of golf course or tennis courts, and even if there were, Black people couldn't go on them. They really couldn't. Now, maybe legally they could, but the social pressure was so terrible. They couldn't. It was not possible. I remember it. I felt it. A Black family could not move into my neighborhood. It could not.
I mean, even the 80s in New York City, we have so many examples of like Black people being chased out, beat up.
I had a friend, Sidney Poland. Okay, her family moved out of the neighborhood. Our neighborhood. They moved out and they sold a house to a Black family. Do you know what happened? The whole neighborhood, this is a fact, organized a car caravan. No, it's true. To go to Sidney Poland's family's new home to picket them. And I'll tell you a funny story. About 40 years later, you'd say in the last 10 years, I can't tell you exactly when, Sidney, by strange happenstance, she sent me an email and, said she had read about me in the web here or there and just wanted to say hello. I wasn't sure if my mind was playing tricks on me. So I said, Sidney, I wonder if I could ask you a question. I know this is going to sound like the weirdest question in God's earth. Am I correct in my memory that when your family sold that house to a Black family, there was a car caravan from our neighborhood to picket your home? She said, yeah, that happened. That's what it was like back then. Now, it was a mixture. Let's be clear, because we want to get the facts right. It was a mixture of pure prejudice, but the bigger factor, in my opinion, it was the issue of property values. The moment you let a Black family in the neighborhood, the property values went through the floor. They went through the floor. My mother, I'll be honest with you, I'm not going to fake the history. My mother was a very decent person, but she would not rent an apartment downstairs. We lived in a two-family home to a Black family because of the property values. So to just get back to where we were, because now we're off on one of my 10,000 excursuses, I don't believe trying to fight race science intellectually has any impact whatsoever. I'm glad there are some people doing it, so the race science doesn't have a clear field. However, the only thing that really refutes it is practice. It's the same thing with Jews. Jews up for the longest time, they were known to be physically feeble, physically weak, and it became the mantra of Jews of the Nazi Holocaust. The Jews went like sheep to slaughter, and everyone imagined the Jews being like Franz Kafka with the big eyes and the big forehead, or Woody Allen. That's what a Jew was. That was what a Jew was. And it took, for better or for worse, it took the fighting prowess, if we can call that, of the Israeli army to overturn that stereotype. Now nobody's going to say Jews are feeble and weaklings. Now that's how we were depicted, as feeble and weaklings. It took critical mass, the Israeli army to refute that. So I don't think it really it pays to try to fight on that terrain. The terrain to fight, whenever I meet a young Black man or woman, and I ask them, "Are you good in math?" And they'll say, "Yeah, I'm pretty good in math." I say, "Then study math." I said, "There's a lot of money out there now for African Americans who have talent in math. Go into math, because you have to overturn that stereotype. And the only way it's going to be overturned is when you start seeing African Americans winning the math competitions. That's the only way. You may not like it, and you may say it's paternalistic what I do, but I loathe those stereotypes so much that I want to see them overturned, but I don't think they can be overturned Kendi style with bromides, pieties, platitudes. That's not going to overturn or change anything any more than Robin DiAngelo sitting around in a session with white people and quote unquote interrupting racism, whatever that means. What does it mean to interrupt racism? That you're going to take a crowbar into the synapse of a brain to interrupt? I mean, the terminology is so moronic. It's so imbecilic that it's just clear there's nothing intellectual going on here. The basic question, which we're not going to be able to answer today, but there's always time tomorrow, as Annie says, tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. The basic question is the one we started with. How did somebody with no academic pedigree, with no publisher that is going to be a standout, how did he? I'm not saying this, Brianna Joy Gray, who I did an interview with a few days ago, she was suggesting that I was being a bit of a snob or an elitist. I'm not being a snob or an elitist. I'm telling you how the world works. When you go to a friend in academia and you say, I published a book, okay? What's the first question that person asks? The first question. They do not ask, what's the content of the book? They don't even ask they do not. I'm telling you, I was in academia marginally. They don't ask, what's the title of the book? They don't ask anything except one question. You know what the one question is? Who published the book? That's it. That's the only question they ask. Who published the book? If you're in academia and you got a PhD, it's the first question everyone asks. They don't even ask you in what field. You know what's the first question they ask? Where? Where? So I'm not talking about my personal, as I said to Brianna Joy Gray, my publishers have not been any great shakes. I published a couple of books with University of California Press. I published one book with University of Minnesota Press, which is crap, by the way. And the rest, It's small. So I would be the last one to say that's a fair ranking, because I think I wrote some, decent books. I do believe that. Not great. They're not going to change the course of humanity, but they were decent. They were respectable. I'm saying that's how the world works.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm asking, or the academic world works. So I asked the question, no great academic pedigree, no great publisher, close inspection of the book shows it's sheer gibberish. How did he end up? Andrew Mellon Professor of the Humanities, executive director of a center that's raking in tens of millions of dollars. How did that happen? And that, to me, which we're going to leave for another day, is the critical question. It's not about Ibram X Kendi, who is a nullity -1. It's not about Ibram X Kendi. It's about the woke culture that created him. That, to me, is the only relevant question, the only substantive question. The woke culture that created from a nullity -1 this veritable cult figure in the United States, be it not just CBS, but all the way from CBS, where he's a paid consultant, all the way from CBS to Democracy Now!, where he's the authority on racism. How did that happen?
I didn't realize that he was on Democracy Now!, but
go to Democracy Now! And do a search.
Take a look. I know there's been
I
know that Amy Goodman has very much fallen off over time, but let's just touch briefly. I don't think we're going to get to the court case, but the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. So this, I believe, came out after Stand from the Beginning. And I think this book, it's like a much more kind of personal Kendi, and you see some of these arguments like in very sharp relief.
There are no arguments in the book. No, I have. I care too much about the life of the mind to credit what he has. You know what that book was? You see, you have to know the inside of how our culture works. Mm-hmm. When you have a bestseller in the United States, immediately the publishers start to say it's called to piggyback. Piggyback means if by some miracle you got a bestseller, they immediately want to get a second book out there. Mm-hmm. Because you're going to make money.
But I mean, to your point, to like assess, the specifics of what he's saying and why he's being allowed to say what he says, even though there's actually no substance to it. I think this book is even more glaring in many respects. Like, first of all,
because there's no research.
Well, it's not just no research. It's that it is so obviously self-contradictory and absurd, even if you're very sympathetic to his claims. So, like, for example, he starts the book essentially. He goes back and says, all right, so this is an update to the 2019 preface, because since the book has come out, there's been so many attacks on it. First of all, he does not deal with any of the specifics of the critiques. And B, the only reason why he has this kind of almost a half mea culpa introduction is to essentially say, look, this is my way of doing anti-racism. If you have any other way that you want to do it, even if you're on my side, we're going to reject that. It's either my way or the highway. It's very similar to Robin DiAngelo, right? There's a very kind of sharp authoritarian style. And to the point of like, well, how contradictory can you get before somebody notices? In my notes to you, there's this chapter that he has in the middle of the book where basically the ostensible reason for the existence of this chapter is to tell the world, look, we have all these stereotypes about Black neighborhoods in inner cities. And these stereotypes are wrong. It's not actually dangerous. Black males actually have a good time in these neighborhoods. The high schools that we go to are perfectly acceptable. And it's very weird because even if this is the ostensible claim of the chapter, it opens up with the story of this guy that he goes to high school with named Smurf. And Smurf is called Smurf because he's supposed to be so black that he's blue. And the chapter opens up with Smurf sticking a gun in Kendi's ribs. Smurf is going around robbing kids, beating kids up. And for his end, Kendi is basically looking around his high school and he's like, there are violent crews is in quotes, right? It's a direct quote, that, quote, ran my high school. And he's talking about feeling very romantic about the possibility of joining a gang called the Zulu Nation. He sees their initiation ritual, and then he decides that, you know what, I don't want to be a part of this. So to me, it's very strange. Why would you have a chapter saying it's actually great to be a black male in a black neighborhood, and then every example that you list from your own life are things that many kids never deal with? And my answer is the only reason he did that, maybe he did know or didn't know that this was contradictory, but to my mind, he did this because he knows since he grew up in 1990s Jamaica, Queens, he's going to have experiences that are pretty different from a generic white person's experience. And it's going to impress them and give him street credibility. It doesn't impress me, however, because as you know, I went to a majority black high school. Every example that he cites, every story that he could give about his high school, guess what? I could give as many stories, if not more, than the stories that he gives. So it's not impressive to me. And I could tell, just knowing how these things sort of play out, that he's just trying to, it's a book written obviously for white people, sheltered white people that don't know any better. That's why he could get away with these examples, because they would be so amazed by some of the individual stories that he won't even stop to assess, well, these arguments make zero sense whatsoever. What is even the point of writing this? Because, and this is another thing, I mean, you talk about this before, but it's like, if we start from the idea that structural racism exists, that slavery has consequences that are going to be reverberating to today, shouldn't we have actual like material examples of this happening? To me, being a black male in the black neighborhood is a prime example of this. If it's actually great to be a black male in a black neighborhood, what are we talking about racism for? If it's as good to be white as it is to be black, what are we talking about racism for?
Well, of course, I agree with that. I would just say that briefly, I would say, number one, the book was obviously rushed by a publisher who wanted to piggyback, or not a publisher who wanted to piggyback. Number two, there's no scholarship in the book. It's just posing and preening. And number three, like you say, every argument he makes in the book is contradicted somewhere else in the book. And that was one of the things I sat down and I tried to demonstrate, that there's no coherent argument here. There's no coherent definition of who is a racist and who isn't a racist. People like W.E.B. Du Bois, who he describes Du Bois's brilliant study, The Philadelphia Negro, he said it's thoroughgoing anti-racist. But then when you read the book, it seems to be racist in every sense that Kendi claims is racist. By his definition, by Kendi's definition, the whole book, Philadelphia Negro, sociological study, was by Kendi's definition racist. So nothing makes any sense. It's completely incoherent. And my guess is, because I have rich experience in this, I can say that most of these books are never read. I know that for a fact. The very first book, which I parsed and exposed as a fraud from time immemorial, it was impossible that that book was read because it was unreadable. It was unreadable. The alleged author was illiterate, even though it's almost certain that person didn't write the book. Then the second book I parsed and became a national issue, was Hitler's Willing Executioners by Daniel Jonah Goldhagen. It was unreadable. Nobody read it. A lot of these books are social, they're cultural phenomena. They have nothing to do with intellectual or academic worth. And that's why we're going to have to leave it off here, and we can, explore it in the future show. That's why, as I said, the only interesting question is, what is the cultural or sociological or political context that makes these books and their alleged authors into phenomena? What is it? And I think there's an interesting point to be made here, that it was the woke culture that created this phenomenon ex nihilo, out of nothing, created this phenomena out of nothing called Ibram X Kendi. And in a future program, we can talk about what is the culture that produced him. But at this point, I have to talk to somebody at 10:30, so I should start getting started.
Okay, and just to close things out, just very briefly, some of the howlers that appear in How to Be an Anti-Racist. He says things, for instance, like, "Look, I grew up just not reading Shakespeare, and I didn't realize why I didn't want to read Shakespeare, and I couldn't read Shakespeare." Then he concludes, "Well, maybe it's because I actually didn't want to, and it wasn't useful." So he's valorizing things like, being almost illiterate. He very uncritically uses phrase like microaggressions. To me, the phrase is incoherent because a microaggression by definition cannot actually be an aggression, since an aggression is intentional. If you have some sort of racial slight or a bias in your mind, that's not an aggression. That's simply a subject of, well, you grew up segregated and you're going to have these kinds of thoughts. He says phrases like intelligence is as subjective as beauty. That's a direct quote. That's wrong because beauty is obviously not subjective. Attraction is subjective, but beauty is an objective, scientifically verifiable thing.
I read your examples. You sent them to me. And again, you see, I think one has to separate out complex ideas from just, as I said, platitudes, pieties, and bromides. The whole question of whether beauty is objective or subjective, it's a very complicated question, especially since the development of the field of evolutionary biology, which is trying to establish that, in fact, there are some aspects of beauty, what they call, I don't know the field at all, but I've read here and there on it, things like a certain physical symmetry, which is construed as beauty because the physical symmetry is, from the point of view of evolutionary biology, was the result of the fact that people who are physically symmetrical were seen as being healthy and robust physically. And
not seen, like there was a kind of instinct that human beings have for
it, but over time
but not conscious.
Asymmetrical people were weeded out, and the symmetrical people were weeded in, and then that became conflated with what's beautiful. Look, the issue is very simple. As with intelligence, as with beauty, as with weighing factors in trying to establish the greatness or not so greatness of a particular historical figure, these are complex intellectual concepts that have been the subject of a huge body of scholarly, serious literature, but none of it, not a jot, not a scratch, not an iota, can be found in anything that Ibram X Kendi ever wrote or ever even was capable, had the capacity to conceive. He's a moron. He's an imbecile. And we have to have the courage as a person on the left to say, well, you know what? A broken clock is right twice a day. What the right wing has been saying about Ibram X Kendi is true. He's a charlatan, he's a grifter, and he's a hustler. And with that, nice to speak to you, but I have to take off because I'm going to get a call in a moment and I have to take it.
Okay, hopefully next time we could actually speak about affirmative action, because your responses to Kendi is my response to the John Roberts opinion. So maybe we could explore that.
Well, that's complicated because, first of all, John Roberts' opinion is not one opinion. He prohibits affirmative action, and then in the last paragraph, he allows for affirmative action.
Exactly. We're going to talk about all that. So it was nice chatting. We'll talk soon.
Okay. Nice to talk to you.
Thank you, guys. Bye.